Not strictly economics in this video. We're going to talk about the basic structure of the government. As we then talk about something called public choice theory, we'll see how a lot of this relates to basic economic kind of stuff. But for now, just facts about the government. The intent of the government, and I stole this picture from the government, but the intent of the Constitution is what's called separation of powers, and we'll talk about that in a second. If you read the Constitution, and we've hopefully read our Constitution now, and we're ready to get going about this stuff, the legislative branch of the government makes laws. Laws come out of the Senate and the House of Representatives. The executive, which is the president and the cabinet, their job is to carry out the laws. And then we have the judicial branch, which interprets the law. So if we have Congress decides they want to build a dam, Congress allocates money for the dam, assuming that all the other little things, we'll talk about that it's the president's job to get that dam built. It might be the Interior Department, something like that, is going to build that dam. If somebody thinks that dam is violating their rights, that dam is going to take from them property without due process of law, say you're a landowner and you're behind the dam and some of your land is going to be underwater after the dam gets there, and you don't think that you were treated properly under the Constitution, you then can go to federal court and maybe all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court arguing that that dam is unconstitutional because it violates your rights. So, separation of powers here. Congress can allocate money but can't really spend it. The executive can spend money but can't allocate it. Neither of those two can violate the Constitution, and the judicial branch is to make sure that that happens. Everybody has their job. Everybody needs somebody. Nobody here can function by themselves. Nobody can, in theory, nobody can get out of line. Nobody can act without interfacing with the others. This idea comes from this guy named Montesquieu, and he really has a really long name. He's one of those old guys with, really long name, but most people just call him Montesquieu. Separation of powers is a theory, and again, when I say, the theory it's very rare for a theory to come from just one person, and he didn't invent this theory. He's not the only person, but his theory is what's referenced by the founding fathers of why separation of powers is good. The founding fathers wanted to prevent tyranny. They wanted to prevent one person from being able to deny them their rights. The King of England making rules for the New World that destroy the rights of Americans. They want to make sure that their new government, no president, no Congress, no whatever, can unilaterally destroy their rights, that it has to be some combination of many, many people who would be required to overrule our rights, and the system is set up to try to prevent that. So separation of powers, checks and balances. The system is about there being a balance between Congress, the president, the judiciary. There's checks on each part of the system, and each part of the system has a unique function. So their function is not duplicated elsewhere. If we want to do something, it requires the action of 2 or 3 parts, which makes it far less likely that we get a dictatorial kind of government or we get violation of our rights. In the legislative branch, we have 2 parts. We have the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives has 435 members. That's established by law in 1911, that we would have 435 members of the House of Representatives. in the United States at the current time, based on what the Constitution says, the maximum number of representatives we could have would be about 10,000, and the minimum would be some multiple of 50, and 435 is where we've been since 1911. The House of Representatives is apportioned by the population of each state. So some states have 1, and California has 45, and that's because we put the number, everybody gets at least 1, and then we divide the 435 up as close as we can to the population of the United States. So you can take 330 million people, divide by 435, and that kind of gives you the layout of how many there should be. But remember, there's got to be at least 1 in each. The only requirements for you to get elected to the House are that you live in your state, you're a citizen, you live in your state, you're at least 25 years old. House of Representatives terms are 2 years, so you get reelected. If you're going to stay in the House, you have to get reelected every 2 years. Sometimes people stay in the House 30 or 40 years, which means they're getting reelected 15, 20 times. Okay? The idea of the House of Representatives from the Constitution is that it's the body that represents the everyday people, that brings into Washington the interests of the everyday people. The other legislative body is the Senate. As we'll see, the Senate has a lot more powers than the House does. There are 100 members in the Senate because there are exactly 2 people from each state. To be a senator, you have to have lived in your state for 9 years. You're a citizen, obviously. You have to be at least 30 years old, and senators serve 6-year terms. The Senate, remember, until, again, the early 1900s, senators were picked by their state legislatures. That was a way to get support from the state legislatures of all the states that they would still have powers under the new Constitution, because the state legislatures would be picking the Senate. So the U.S. Senate would be spawned from the state legislatures, effectively, not voted in by the people. The Senate has the most power and authority. Those 6-year terms are there to also give them the experience. The Senate's always got more experience among its members than the House does. The Founding Fathers really intended that the country be run by the best and brightest and smartest, and this was part of their system to get us there. So the Congress, between it, the House is overseen or led by a speaker. That speaker's voted a majority vote of the members of the House. Obviously, in our 2-party system, whichever party has the most people in the House is the one that's going to end up with the speaker. When the Republicans control the House, we had a Republican speaker. Now the Democrats, as I speak on this, control the House, and we have a Democrat speaker. But it can be very contentious and very interesting, and really exciting. The Democrats owned the House for a long time, and so the Speaker of the House for many, many years was the same person. It's all very interesting. The President of the Senate, the technical leader of the Senate, is the Vice President of the United States. It's about the only thing the Vice President gets to do is be the President of the Senate, and the Vice President of the United States gets to vote when there's a tie. So we've had a couple of instances in recent memory where there was a tie on a nomination of somebody for the Supreme Court, for example, and the Vice President of the United States voted to break the tie. Both units of Congress create their own rules. I'll give you an example of what that means. The Senate has a rule that says it takes 60 votes to bring something to the floor for a vote. However, sometimes they change that. So it should take 60 votes to appoint a judge or a Supreme Court justice. But because justices and judges weren't getting appointed, Congress changed that rule. The Senate changed that rule, and so it only takes 51 to get a judge or a Supreme Court justice. On the other hand, to do other business, they haven't changed that rule. So, again, while I'm sitting here talking about this. The government shut down, and they're arguing about the wall. The Republicans controlled the Senate, they controlled the House, and they controlled the presidency for 2 years. They could have changed the rule, passed the wall with 51 votes out of the Senate because it got passed out of the House. It could have been, they could have done that. They chose not to do that. And now they're blaming the Democrats in the House for not passing the wall when they had 2 years where they could have changed the rules. And so it's strange. The American political system is strange that the Republicans can own both houses of Congress and the White House and choose not to do things that they want to do because they don't want to change the rules. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that stuff and economic aspects of that stuff here in a later lecture. The limitation on Congress people is that if you're elected to the Senate or the House, you cannot serve in the executive. So sometimes we hear, for example, that a senator wants to become Secretary of State. Well, to become Secretary of State, they have to give up their seat. If someone from the House wants to become Secretary of Defense, they have to give up their seat in the House. You cannot sit in Congress and work in one of the executive offices, in one of the presidential offices, one of the cabinet offices at the same time. You have to be separate. Again, separation of powers. So to pass a law, that law has to pass both the Senate and the House with majority of the quorum. Not necessarily a majority of the members, but a majority of the quorum, which is 50%. So it never happens this way, but in technicality, something can pass with far fewer votes. You need half of the Senate to be there. You need 50 senators to be there. So theoretically, something could pass the Senate with 26 votes. That never happens. They always are all there. They always set it up so that everybody's there. And usually, if not everybody votes, close to everybody votes on everything. For a bill to then become law, the president has to sign it. If the president refuses to sign it, which is called a veto, it goes back to both houses. The president has to explain why they vetoed it, and then if both houses repass it again with a 2/3 majority, becomes law over the president's objection. Again, checks and balances. So Congress has to get the president to agree, or an overwhelming majority of Congress then has to override the president if he doesn't agree. In a second, we're going to talk about the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act was vetoed by President Nixon, but repassed by Congress and became law. So there's this whole balance thing. It doesn't happen very often. Presidents historically don't veto a lot of laws, and when they veto them, they're very unlikely to get overruled. One of the unique things about the Constitution is that the president has to sign or veto the entire bill. If you go to a state governors have what are called line item vetoes, which means if there are 10 things in the bill, a state governor can wipe out one of them, veto that one line, and keep the other 9 things. In U.S., U.S. government, federal government, we can't do that, which means very often Congress takes what's called pork, extra stuff that's just a present for this person or that person, or something that maybe the president really doesn't want, and they attach it to a law that the president really doesn't want. So there might be something the president wants, and something totally unrelated is just stacked on to the end. The president, to keep the rest of it, has to take that little part at the end. The president can't just veto that little part at the end. They either have to take the whole thing or nothing, and usually they end up taking the whole thing, which means there's all this extra stuff that gets passed through Congress that the president would never have approved if it had come through separately, but they get it because they attach it to something the president really wants.